Houston, Texas. A city built on oil, ambition, and the promise of a fresh start. But behind the bright lights of the space city lies a darker reality, one where warning signs are often ignored until the sirens start screaming. It started with a citywide Amber Alert that lit up every phone in Harris County. A 4-year-old girl named Maleah Davis was gone. Her stepfather told a story of a violent kidnapping, of 3 men, a stolen truck, and a roadside assault. It was a story so dramatic, it almost sounded like a movie, and that was the first red flag. But Maleah's story is just the beginning. From the breaking of a mother's mind to a system that sees the danger coming and still fails to stop it, we are diving into the cases that changed Houston forever. This isn't just about the crimes, it's about the victims who became symbols of our greatest failures. Because in this city, evil doesn't always look like rage. Sometimes, it looks like devotion twisted by delusion. This is Houston. Say their names. And never look away. On the morning of May 11, 2019, a citywide Amber Alert lit up phones across Houston. The missing child was 4 years old. Her name was Maleah Davis. The alert said she'd been last seen days earlier. The details were thin. The story didn't make sense. And that was the first red flag. Maleah lived in a Houston apartment with her mother, Brittany Bowens, and her mother's boyfriend, Darian Vence. When police asked where Maleah was, Vence had a story ready. He said 3 Hispanic men jumped him. He said they kidnapped Maleah. He said they stole his truck and left him unconscious on the side of the road. It sounded dramatic. Too dramatic. And within hours, investigators began pulling at threads that unraveled everything. Maleah Davis was 4 years old. She loved cartoons. She loved pink. She had recently undergone multiple brain surgeries to treat a rare condition called craniosynosis, a disorder that affects skull development. She was medically fragile. Which meant something else was immediately obvious to detectives. If Maleah had been abducted, she would have needed medication. No medication was missing. No diaper bag. No clothing. No essentials. Just a story. As police searched for Maleah, they uncovered something chilling. She had not been seen alive for days before the Amber Alert went out. Neighbors reported they hadn't seen her since April 30th. That meant the timeline was already broken. When investigators searched the apartment, they found signs of extensive cleaning. Bleach. Fresh paint. Discarded carpet. This wasn't panic. This was cleanup. Then came the discovery that shifted the entire case. Surveillance footage surfaced showing Darian Vence carrying a large blue laundry basket out of the apartment complex in the early hours of May 7th. The basket looked heavy. Too heavy. It was the kind of image that doesn't leave your head once you see it. As pressure mounted, police arrested Vence, not for kidnapping, but for tampering with evidence. And then the truth began to surface. On May 17, 2019, Maleah's remains were found in a ditch along the side of the road in Arkansas, wrapped in a plastic bag. She was not alive when she was taken there. The autopsy revealed that Maleah had suffered blunt force trauma. She had been beaten. And she had been beaten inside her own home. Prosecutors would later explain what happened next. On the night Maleah died, Darian Vence was alone with her. Brittany Bowens was out of town. Maleah cried. She needed care. And instead of help, she received violence. Vence later admitted that Maleah had been struck, though he claimed it was accidental. The medical evidence said otherwise. This was not a fall. This was not a single blow. This was fatal abuse. What made the case even more disturbing was what investigators learned about the months leading up to Maleah's death. There had been prior reports. Neighbors had heard arguments. Teachers had noticed injuries. Child Protective Services had been involved. In March 2019, CPS investigated allegations that Maleah had been abused by Vence. Maleah was temporarily removed from the home. But weeks later, she was returned. Less than a month after that, she was dead. The system had looked at Maleah. And then it looked away. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors made their position clear. This was not just about one violent act. It was about a pattern. A pattern of injuries. A pattern of excuses. A pattern of silence. And it wasn't just about vents. Because while Brittany Bowens was not present the night Maleah died, prosecutors argued she failed to protect her child. They charged her with injury to a child by omission. In Texas, that charge carries real weight. It means the law believes you had a duty to act. And you didn't. In 2021, Darian Vance pleaded guilty to murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. During sentencing, the judge spoke directly about Maleah. "This little girl depended on you," he said. "And you betrayed that trust." Brittany Bowens later pleaded guilty to injury to a child by omission and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. The courtroom was quiet. There was no celebration. Just a sense that whatever justice looked like, it came too late. Maleah Davis was 4 years old. She should be starting school now. She should be losing baby teeth. She should be alive. Instead, her name is spoken in courtrooms and classrooms as a warning. Her case forced Houston to confront painful truths. That CPS involvement doesn't always mean safety. That returning a child to a dangerous home can be fatal. That silence is sometimes the loudest failure of all. The image that many people remember most is that laundry basket. A simple object. Something meant for clothes. Turned into a symbol of how easily a child can be erased when no one intervenes in time. Houston remembers Maleah Davis. Her story didn't end with an Amber Alert. It ended in a ditch, far from home, because the adults in her life chose convenience, excuses, and self-preservation over protection. Say her name. Maleah Davis. She was real. She mattered. And her story should never be forgotten. On the morning of October 12, 2015, a call came into Houston police that sounded routine. A child was not breathing. By the time first responders arrived at the apartment, Noah Quattro was already gone. He was 4 years old. And what they saw inside that home told investigators this wasn't sudden, and it wasn't accidental. Noah's body was severely underweight. His ribs were visible. His skin was cold. And the injuries covering him didn't come from one moment. They came from months. Noah lived in Houston with his mother, Araceli Quattro, and her boyfriend, Brandon Lake. From the outside, the apartment looked ordinary. Inside, Noah's life had been reduced to survival. Investigators would later learn that Noah was systematically starved, confined, and abused. Food was withheld as punishment. He was locked inside a small room for hours, sometimes days. He was beaten when he cried. And when his body began to fail, no one helped him. Doctors testified that Noah weighed far below what a 4-year-old should weigh. He was malnourished to the point that his organs were struggling. Medical experts described his condition as chronic starvation, not neglect, not oversight, but prolonged deprivation. This wasn't about poverty. Food was in the apartment. This was about control. Prosecutors told the jury that Noah's abuse followed a pattern. When he didn't behave correctly, he was punished. When he cried, he was punished again. When he became weak, the punishments continued. Neighbors later told investigators they heard crying through the walls. They assumed it was discipline. They assumed someone else would step in. No one did. What makes Noah's case even harder to hear is what happened before his death. Child Protective Services had been involved. Reports had been made. Concerns were raised about Noah's safety and living conditions. At one point, CPS investigated the home. But Noah remained there. Weeks later, he was dead. When paramedics pronounced Noah deceased, Araceli Quattro and Brandon Lake had explanations ready. They claimed Noah was sick. They said he stopped breathing suddenly. They said they didn't know what happened. But the medical examiner did. The autopsy showed that Noah died from blunt force trauma combined with starvation and dehydration. His body simply couldn't take any more. Prosecutors described Noah's death as the inevitable result of relentless cruelty. They showed the jury photos. They walked them through timelines. They explained how starvation changes the body, how it weakens muscles, slows organs, and makes even minor injuries fatal. This wasn't a mystery. This was cause and effect. As the case moved to trial, the defense attempted to minimize responsibility. They argued stress. They argued discipline. They argued poor judgment. The jury rejected all of it. Because discipline doesn't starve a child. And poor judgment doesn't lock a 4-year-old in a room until his body shuts down. In 2018, both defendants were convicted. Araceli Quattro was found guilty of injury to a child by omission. Brandon Lake was convicted of capital murder. Lake was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Quattro was sentenced to 50 years in prison. During sentencing, the judge spoke directly about Noah. "This child depended on you," the judge said. "And you allowed him to waste away." Noah Quattro was 4 years old. He should be starting school now. Learning letters. Making friends. Running without getting tired. Instead, his life ended on the floor of an apartment where hunger was used as punishment and silence was enforced. Houston didn't just grieve Noah. The city questioned itself. How does a child become so malnourished in a city full of food? How does a child die slowly while reports exist? How many signs were missed because they didn't look dramatic enough? Noah's case exposed a truth Houston has faced again and again. That prolonged abuse doesn't always look violent from the outside. Sometimes it looks quiet. In the aftermath, CPS policies were reviewed. Training was updated. Officials promised change. But no policy revision brings Noah back. The image many jurors said stayed with them wasn't the injuries. It was Noah's size. A 4-year-old who looked half that age. A child who had learned hunger before he learned how to read. Araceli Quattro and Brandon Lake will spend decades, possibly the rest of their lives, behind bars. Noah never got a childhood. And his case forces a question that never sits comfortably. How many children are suffering right now, quietly, behind doors no one opens? Say his name. Noah Quattro. He was real. He mattered. And his story must never be reduced to a statistic. On the morning of November 29, 2007, a fisherman walking along Galveston Bay noticed something floating near the shoreline. At first, he thought it was debris. Then he got closer. What he found was the torso of a small child, wrapped in plastic, sealed inside a storage container. The child had no head, no arms, no legs, and no one knew who she was. Texas authorities called her Baby Grace. She was estimated to be between 2 and 3 years old. And someone had gone to great lengths to make sure she would never be identified. The discovery shocked the entire region. News stations interrupted programming. Police held emergency press conferences. Search teams scoured miles of coastline for the rest of the body. What they found over the following days confirmed the worst fears investigators had. Baby Grace hadn't died accidentally. She had been murdered. And then dismembered. The autopsy revealed extensive injuries. Bruising in various stages of healing. Fractures that occurred before death. Evidence of repeated physical abuse. This child had not lived a safe life. She had lived in pain. And then, someone tried to erase her. For weeks, Baby Grace remained unidentified. No missing child report matched her description. No one came forward. That silence became its own horror. How does a child vanish so completely that no one is looking for her? Investigators launched a nationwide campaign. Billboards. television appeals, DNA databases. And slowly, the truth began to surface. In December 2007, police arrested Kimberly Dawn Traynor, a Houston woman who had been living under an assumed identity. Her real name wasn't Kimberly Traynor. It was Kimberly Dawn Traynor Sawyers. And she was the child's mother. Once arrested, Kimberly told investigators a story designed to distance herself from the crime. She claimed her daughter had died accidentally. She blamed her husband. She said she was scared. But the evidence didn't support any of it. The child's real name was Riley Ann Sawyers. She was 2 years old. She had lived with her mother and stepfather, Joshua Wade Traynor, in Houston. Behind closed doors, Riley's life was a nightmare. Prosecutors would later show that Riley was subjected to chronic abuse. She was beaten. She was starved. She was neglected. Medical experts testified that Riley had suffered injuries consistent with long-term maltreatment, not a single fatal incident. Her body showed signs that her short life had been filled with fear. On the day Riley died, prosecutors said she was beaten so severely that her body could not survive it. Instead of calling 911, instead of seeking help, the adults in her life made a different choice. They decided to dispose of her body. What followed was one of the most disturbing cover-ups Texas had ever seen. Riley's body was dismembered. Her head and limbs were separated from her torso. Her remains were sealed in containers and discarded in different locations. This wasn't panic. This was deliberate. Someone took time. Someone planned. The goal was simple. Make sure no one ever knew who Riley was. Make sure no one ever connected her death to the people responsible. But investigators kept pushing. They traced false identities. They followed financial records. They compared timelines. And eventually, everything led back to Kimberly and her husband. Joshua Traynor pleaded guilty to tampering with evidence for his role in dismembering and disposing of Riley's body. But the focus of the trial centered on Kimberly. Because Riley was her child. And prosecutors argued that she didn't just fail to protect her daughter. She participated. During trial, jurors heard testimony about Riley's life. How she was isolated. How neighbors rarely saw her. How no daycare records existed. She lived almost entirely out of sight. Which made it easier for the abuse to continue. In 2010, a jury convicted Kimberly Dawn Traynor of capital murder. The punishment phase was swift. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Joshua Traynor was sentenced to 10 years in prison for evidence tampering. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. No one argued. No one protested. Because by then, the evidence had made one thing clear. Riley Ann Sawyers had been betrayed at every level. Riley was 2 years old. She should have been learning words. Taking unsteady steps. Laughing at small things. Instead, her life ended violently, and her body was treated like something to be hidden. The case of baby Grace forced Houston and the surrounding counties to confront an uncomfortable truth. That some children live so far outside the system that their deaths barely register until it's too late. That abuse can happen quietly. That children can disappear while still alive, long before anyone reports them missing. Even today, Riley is remembered by 2 names. Baby Grace, the child no one knew. And Riley Ann Sawyers, the little girl who finally got her identity back. Her grave now bears her real name. Not the nickname given by police. Not the label given by the media. But the name she should have been called while she was alive. Houston remembers Riley Ann Sawyers. Not because of how she died. But because her story exposed how easily a child can be erased when no one is watching. Say her name. Riley Ann Sawyers. She was real. She mattered. And her story must never be forgotten. On a quiet afternoon in Houston, paramedics were called to an apartment for a toddler who was unresponsive. The child was 2 years old. Her name was Ariana de la Garza. By the time first responders arrived, it was already too late. And just like in so many cases before it, the adults in the room had a story ready. Ariana lived with her mother, Rosa de la Garza, and her mother's boyfriend, Raul Rodriguez. To neighbors, the family seemed ordinary. No obvious signs. No visible chaos. No one calling 911 before that final day. Inside the apartment, Ariana's life was very different. Doctors at the hospital immediately knew something was wrong. Ariana's body showed severe trauma. Bruising covered her small frame. Internal injuries told a story that could not be explained away. Medical examiners testified that her wounds were inflicted over time, not caused by a single accident. This was not a fall. This was ongoing abuse. When questioned, Rosa de la Garza and Raul Rodriguez gave explanations that shifted and changed. They claimed Ariana had fallen. They said she was clumsy. They suggested she had hurt herself while playing. But the medical evidence dismantled every version. Ariana had suffered blunt force trauma so severe that her internal organs failed. Her injuries were consistent with being struck repeatedly. Prosecutors would later explain to the jury that Ariana didn't die suddenly. She lived through pain. She lived through injuries that would have caused extreme distress in a child her age. And no one protected her. Investigators reconstructed Ariana's short life. They learned that discipline in the home was harsh. That crying was met with punishment. That Ariana had been struck when she didn't comply quickly enough. The abuse escalated. And as Ariana became weaker, the violence continued. What made the case even more devastating was the role of her mother. Rosa de la Garza was present. She saw the injuries. She heard the crying. Prosecutors argued she failed to protect her daughter, choosing her relationship over her child's safety. Under Texas law, that choice carries criminal responsibility. As Ariana's case moved toward trial, jurors were shown medical diagrams. Doctors explained how much force it takes to cause the injuries Ariana suffered. They explained that a toddler's body is fragile. That repeated trauma compounds. That even when the final blow isn't intended to kill, the outcome can still be fatal. The defense attempted to soften the narrative. They argued stress. They argued lack of intent. They argued that the injuries were accidental. The jury rejected all of it. Because accidents don't leave patterns. And discipline does not destroy a child's organs. In Harris County Court, both defendants were convicted. Raul Rodriguez was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rosa de la Garza was convicted of injury to a child by omission and sentenced to decades in prison. As the verdicts were read, the courtroom was silent. There was no relief. Only finality. Ariana de la Garza was 2 years old. She should be learning words. Exploring the world. Reaching for comfort when she was scared. Instead, her life ended in a place where pain replaced care. Ariana's death forced Houston to confront another uncomfortable reality. That very young children cannot advocate for themselves. That abuse can exist quietly behind closed doors. That when warning signs are ignored, the consequences are irreversible. Neighbors later told investigators they had heard crying. They assumed it was normal. They assumed someone else would intervene. No one did. Today, Ariana's case is cited in child protection training. Her name is spoken in courtrooms and classrooms. Not because of how she died, but because her story illustrates how easily a child can be trapped in violence when every adult fails them. The people responsible will never raise another child. They will spend their lives behind bars. But Ariana never got a childhood. And no sentence can change that. Houston remembers Ariana de la Garza. She was real. She mattered. And her story stands as a reminder that silence is not neutral. Sometimes, it's deadly. Say her name. Ariana de la Garza. On the afternoon of June 24, 2016, a quiet suburban street in Katy erupted into chaos. It was broad daylight. Neighbors were home. Cars were parked in driveways. And within minutes, 2 teenage girls would be dead. Shot by their own mother. Their names were Taylor Sheets and Madison Sheets. Taylor was 22 years old. Madison was 17. They were sisters. And they never made it back inside their home. That day was supposed to be ordinary. It was their father Jason Sheets' birthday. The family was home together. Then their mother, Christy Sheets, called everyone into the living room for what she described as a family meeting. No one sensed danger. There was no warning. Christy left the room briefly. When she returned, she was holding a .38 caliber revolver. Without speaking, she opened fire. The first shot hit Madison. She screamed and ran. Jason lunged toward Christy, trying to stop her. But Christy turned the gun on Taylor and fired again. Taylor ran out the front door. Bleeding. Terrified. Desperate for help. What happened next unfolded in front of witnesses. Neighbors watched as the 2 girls collapsed in the street. Christy followed them outside. She stood over her daughters. And she shot them again. Police officers arrived within minutes. They found Christy standing in the street, gun still in hand. They ordered her to drop the weapon. She refused. Officers opened fire. Christy Sheets was killed at the scene. Taylor and Madison were already gone. The entire attack lasted less than 10 minutes. 2 lives erased. 1 family destroyed. On a birthday. As investigators pieced together what happened, the picture that emerged was deeply disturbing. Christy Sheets had planned this. This wasn't a moment of rage. This wasn't an accident. This was retaliation. Court records and police interviews revealed that Christy's marriage had been unraveling for years. There were at least 14 prior calls to the home for domestic disturbances. Arguments. Threats. Mental health crises. The warning signs were everywhere. Christy was furious that her husband had talked about divorce. She was angry that Taylor was engaged and planning a future Christy didn't control. Prosecutors would later explain her motive in stark terms. If she couldn't have her family, Jason wouldn't either. She didn't kill her daughters because she hated them. She killed them to punish their father. Law enforcement called it spousal revenge filicide. And it is one of the rarest and most disturbing forms of family violence. Taylor was engaged to be married. She had just graduated college. She was planning a wedding. A life. Madison was about to start her senior year of high school. She loved music. She wanted to be a teacher. Both futures ended in the street outside their home. Jason Sheets survived. Physically. But he lost everything else. His wife. Both daughters. His family, gone in minutes. The Katy community was shaken to its core. This wasn't a hidden crime behind closed doors. It happened where everyone could see it. Neighbors who witnessed the shooting later said the images never left them. First responders described it as one of the most traumatic scenes of their careers. The case sparked national conversations. About domestic violence. About untreated mental illness. About firearm access during family crises. And about how many warning signs it takes before intervention happens. Because this wasn't sudden. It wasn't unpredictable. The calls had been made. The disturbances documented. The danger known. But nothing stopped it. Taylor and Madison Sheets were not children in the traditional sense. But they were still daughters. Still dependent on the adults who were supposed to protect them. And in the end, the threat came from the one person they trusted most. Today, their names are remembered across the Houston metro area. Not as headlines, but as reminders that violence inside families doesn't always look chaotic. Sometimes it looks calculated. Christy Sheets never stood trial. She was killed at the scene. There was no sentencing. No prison. No closure. Only aftermath. Taylor and Madison were buried days later. Their father stood alone. And a neighborhood that once felt safe never felt the same again. Houston remembers Taylor Sheets. Houston remembers Madison Sheets. They were real. They mattered. And their deaths exposed how devastating family violence can become when it goes unchecked. Say their names. Taylor Sheets. Madison Sheets. On the morning of June 20, 2001, a woman in Houston picked up the phone and called police. Her voice was calm. She said she needed an officer to come to her home. Then she called her husband at work and told him the same thing. When officers arrived at the house on Beachcomber Lane, they found a scene that would become one of the most infamous crimes in American history. 5 children were dead. All of them drowned in their own bathtub. And the person who killed them was their mother. Her name was Andrea Yates. Andrea Yates was a stay-at-home mother. She and her husband, Rusty Yates, had 5 children, all under the age of 8. From the outside, the family looked deeply religious, structured, and disciplined. Inside the home, something was unraveling. For years before the killings, Andrea had struggled with severe postpartum depression and psychosis. She had been hospitalized multiple times. She had attempted suicide. Doctors warned that she should not have more children. They warned that she should not be left alone with them. Those warnings were documented. And then they were ignored. On the morning of June 20th, Andrea waited until Rusty left for work. She then methodically drowned each of her children, one by one. No chaos. No interruption. When it was over, she laid their bodies out on the bed. Then she called police. The victims were Noah Yates, 7. John Yates, 5. Paul Yates, 3. Luke Yates, 2. Mary Yates, 6 months. 5 lives erased in less than an hour. When Andrea was arrested, she did not deny what she had done. She told police she believed her children were not developing properly. She believed they were doomed. She believed killing them would save them from eternal damnation. These were not excuses. They were delusions. The case shocked Houston. Then it shocked the nation. Because this wasn't a hidden crime. This wasn't neglect. This was a mother who loved her children and still killed them. At trial, prosecutors argued that Andrea knew right from wrong. They pointed to the phone calls. They pointed to the planning. They argued that mental illness did not absolve her of responsibility. In 2002, a jury agreed. Andrea Yates was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. But the story didn't end there. During the trial, a prosecution expert falsely testified that a television episode depicted a similar crime, something that never happened. That testimony was later proven false. And in 2005, Andrea Yates' conviction was overturned. At her second trial in 2006, the jury reached a different conclusion. Andrea Yates was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a state mental hospital, where she remains today. That verdict divided Houston and the country. Some believed justice had finally been served. Others believed 5 children had been erased without consequence. And many didn't know what to believe at all. This case forced a national conversation about mental illness, motherhood, and responsibility. Where does accountability end? Where does illness begin? And how many warnings does it take before intervention actually happens? Doctors warned Andrea should not have more children. She had 5. Doctors warned she should not be left alone with them. She was. The system didn't fail once. It failed repeatedly. Rusty Yates was never charged. But his role was scrutinized heavily. The pressure to have more children. The refusal to remove Andrea from caregiving. the insistence on faith over medical advice. These decisions were not criminal, but they were consequential. Andrea Yates did not act in secret. Her illness was known. Her danger was documented. And still, 5 children died. Today, Andrea Yates lives in a secure psychiatric facility. She will never be released. She will never raise another child. She will never escape what she did. But neither will Houston. The Yates case remains a point of reference whenever postpartum psychosis is discussed. Whenever maternal mental health is debated. Whenever the limits of punishment are questioned. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary Yates are remembered not just as victims, but as symbols of what happens when warning signs are acknowledged and ignored at the same time. This case does not offer easy closure. It doesn't end with certainty. It ends with questions. And that's why it belongs at the end of this series. Because evil doesn't always look like rage. Sometimes it looks like illness. Sometimes it looks like devotion twisted by delusion. And sometimes, the system sees it coming, and still doesn't stop it. Houston remembers the Yates children. Say their names. Because remembering is the last thing we can do for them. Noah. John. Paul. Luke. Mary. They were real. They mattered. And their lives should never be reduced to a footnote in a debate.